These are not dead soldiers being pulled out of the battlefield. They were alive and heading into combat while lying inside torpedo shells. This is a bouncing bomb, but how to aim and control it? There was also the flying platform to take soldiers into the sky, to aim and shoot enemies from above, to a giant wheel that was supposed to explode on enemy lines, but ended up rolling back to its own side and almost killed its inventors. And finally, the first aircraft that could hover like a helicopter and fly like a plane, except for no one had the guts to pilot it. Here are 5 crazy military inventions only fit for the "that didn't work" section of military history. In the heat of World War II, Brigadier General John O'Daniel came up with an ingenious idea to transport troops into heavily defended positions. He suggested to cut torpedoes in half and use them as sleds, just large enough to hold one soldier lying down. 6 were hooked together and attached to each side of a tank, and the 12 sleds were pulled forward in the paths made by the tank's tracks, enabling an infantry squad to accompany a tank without being exposed to small arms fire and anti-personnel mines. In theory, it sounds awesome, right? But in reality, well, not so much. The sleds were hated by the infantrymen who felt like dead ducks in them. They were lying there, doing nothing, and just waiting to be the target of enemy fire from above. Their use was also impeded by rough ground and the loss of the tanks pulling the chains of sleds. The Army has manufactured 360 sleds, and all of them have been deployed at Anzio with no satisfying result. O'Daniel himself viewed the combat trials as inconclusive. But O'Daniel was not the only one who tried to use battle sleds in World War II. Germany, Russia, and the British also experimented with different types of battle sleds, but none of them were very successful either. The Germans built large battle sleds that were towed behind an assault gun, but they were rarely used in combat. The Russians used armored battle sleds in the Winter War against Finland, but they were also slow and vulnerable. After a lot of unsuccessful iterations, battle sleds slid into history. But why just sled when you can fly? Well, the US Army had the perfect solution, the Hiller VZ-1 Pawnee. It was a one-man hovercraft that used 2 counter-rotating fans to lift the pilot off the ground. The pilot controlled the direction and speed by shifting his body weight like a skateboard in the air. Sounds cool, right? But hold on the excitement. The hovercraft had some serious drawbacks that made it a very impractical and dangerous device. For starters, it could only fly up to 10 feet high and 16 miles per hour. At this high-end speed, it will only become an easy shooting target for the enemy. But the worst part was the stability. The hovercraft was notoriously unstable and difficult to control, especially in windy conditions. The Hiller VZ-1 Pawnee was developed in the 1950s, but it never saw any combat or practical use. It was deemed too risky and inefficient for military purposes and was eventually scrapped in the 1960s. It remains one of the most bizarre and hilarious examples of failed military inventions. But the US military also has another failed aircraft at their museum. Imagine a plane that can take off and land vertically like a helicopter, but fly faster and farther like a jet. Well, that's what the US Navy thought when they commissioned the Convair XFY-Pogo. The Pogo was a prototype of a vertical takeoff and landing fighter plane that was designed to operate from small warships. It had a large propeller at the front and a delta wing at the back, and it looked like a giant dart. The idea was that the Pogo would take off and land by tilting its nose up and sitting on its tail. Then, it would transition to horizontal flight by rotating its body 90 degrees. Sounds cool in theory, but in fact, the Pogo had some serious flaws that made it a very impractical and dangerous aircraft. For instance, it was extremely hard to control and maneuver, especially during the transition from vertical to horizontal flight. But the worst part was the landing. The pilot had to look back behind himself during a landing to properly stabilize the craft. But enough about the US Army's innovation. Let's turn our gaze to the British engineering marvel, or to be precise, disaster. In 1943, the British had a genius idea to create a giant wheel of doom, loaded with explosives and propelled by rockets. They named this device the Great Panjandrum. It is a prototype of a self-propelled explosive device that was designed to breach the German defenses on the beaches of Normandy during World War II. It consisted of a large wooden wheel, about 10 feet in diameter, that was fitted with 32 cordite rockets and a 4,000-pound bomb in the center. The idea was that the Panjandrum would be launched from a landing craft, roll across the ground, and explode on the enemy fortifications, creating a gap for the Allied troops to advance. But the thing is, the Great Panjandrum had some serious flaws that made it a very impractical and dangerous device. For example, it was extremely unstable and unpredictable, as the rockets were not synchronized and often malfunctioned. The wheel would veer off course, spin out of control, or even turn back towards the launchers. The Great Panjandrum was tested several times, but it never worked as intended. One test was witnessed by a group of high-ranking officials, including Winston Churchill and Dwight Eisenhower. They were not impressed by the spectacle and quickly abandoned the project. But the British has also another marvelous invention. What do you get when you combine a bomb and a rubber ball? A deadly weapon that can bounce over enemy lines, or a silly deadly toy that can bounce back to your face? Well, the British Army tried to find that out with the bouncing bomb. The bouncing bomb was a prototype of an aerial bomb that was designed to destroy dams and bridges during World War II. It consisted of a spherical metal casing filled with explosives. It was dropped from a plane at a low altitude and a high speed, and it was supposed to bounce on the water surface until it hit the target. The idea was that the bouncing bomb would overcome the defensive nets and torpedoes that protected the enemy structures and explode at the right moment to cause maximum damage. Sounds awesome, right? Well, not really. The bouncing bomb had some serious flaws that made it a very impractical and dangerous device. For starters, it was extremely hard to aim and time, as the bomb had to be dropped at a precise angle and distance from the target. The slightest miscalculation could result in a miss or a premature detonation. The bomb was deemed too risky and unreliable for military use and was eventually replaced by other practical bombs. Of course, none of these inventions are in use today. But if you have any ideas on how these prototypes can be used and modified for today's warfare, we'd love to hear your comments.